Okay, well, while we're getting the slides set up, I first want to say thank you so much for having me come to your symposium today. As Emmy mentioned, I have been in this field for quite a long time. I have done a lot of different things at different places, but I am still very much learning this field myself. This is a very large field. This is an evolving field. This is, I think, going in many different directions, so it's difficult to keep up. So while I hope you get something out of my presentation today, I also expect to learn a lot from all of you. So thank you again for having me. I really appreciate being here. So I want to talk today. I'm going to start talking a little bit about why are we even here today? What are we talking about when we think about sharing data? How can we understand the role of librarians in this space? And then I want to talk about my experience at Purdue University, University of Michigan, and University at Buffalo. Each institution that I've been a part of has taken a slightly different approach to research data based on time, based on circumstances, based on our engagement with researchers themselves and learning about more what their needs are. So that's what I hope to cover today with you all. So I want to take a moment to talk about what are data. So when we say sharing data, what is it we actually mean by that statement? And I will introduce you to the definition of research data that is used most often by the United States government. And this is the definition that's also used by funding agencies. And in reading it, your research data is defined as the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as necessary to validate research findings. And this is a fine definition, but I don't think it fully covers everything that is possible in this space, right? So I prefer more of this kind of definition. This is from a colleague of mine, Chuck Humphrey from the University of Alberta, who is now retired. But he said, I prefer to think of research data as information structured by methodology and organized in digital products that are used as evidence in the research process. And I like this because the first definition kind of equates or implies that data are numbers. And I don't think that's the case. I think research data can be any one of a number of different types of information. It can be text, it can be audio, it can be video, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. The other thing that I like about this definition is the looking at data from a methodological standpoint, right? So what that tells me is that anything can be a data set. So for example, if you take a look at newspapers, newspapers are generally used by human beings to read and to understand what is happening in the world. But for research purposes, they can be used to get a better understanding of a particular moment in time or a particular understanding of how language is used. You can do this through text mining or other kinds of analysis for research purposes. So even though newspapers aren't strictly speaking something that you would think of as data, it can be used as data using particular methodologies. So you've probably seen data lifecycle models before, and I bring it in here because I think it's important as a means of communicating the kinds of services that we have and engaging with researchers. So there are many different types of data lifecycle models. This is one that I've used in the past. At the far side there's the planning stage. Then you go into acquiring data, so gathering the data in some way, shape, or form, talking about the process of data. How do you take data and do things to it to make it useful for your purposes? Then doing the analysis of the data, asking your research question to the data and trying to find answers. Then moving on to preserving that research data, of keeping it around for a longer period of time. And then thinking about how do you publish and share it. And throughout that process, there are questions around how do you describe that data sufficiently so that you can understand what it is that you're doing and communicate that out to other people who may be interested in your data. There's questions around managing the quality of the data. So how are you ensuring that your data are high quality enough to be able to ask your research questions of and to trust and to get validated answers as a result? And then thinking about how do you care for the data in terms of storing it, in terms of backing it up, and in terms of ensuring its security so that it is protected from unauthorized access. So all of these things are really important aspects to think about going through the data process. And I think what really is important about the data lifecycle is that it conveys a sense that data are a process. They go through several stages. They're not born fully formed. And each of those stages require particular tasks in order to manage the data sufficiently, and at the end, to be able to share it with other people in a way that they can understand and make use of themselves. So why are we talking about data? Well, I think there's a number of different reasons. First, it's because increasingly we have to, right? We are seeing that governments and funding agencies and publishers are now expecting that research data will be made available as a condition of funding or as a condition of publication. And so researchers are being sort of forced to think about what to do with their data and how to satisfy those requirements. But I don't think we should stop there. I think we should continue to think about what other benefits there might be from looking at data and looking at our involvement with research data. There are questions around trust in research and reproducibility, and having access to the data can engender more trust in the results. So increasing the output and the impact of research. And then at the bottom, researchers sharing data, there may be some benefits for them directly. And there have been a couple of studies that have been done that show that researchers who share their data get increased citations as a result of doing so. So it's a way of increasing or maximizing your professional reputation by putting your data out there and letting others investigate and explore the work that you do with more depth. So why librarians? It's not enough just to take a data set and to put it on a server and to make it available. Data need context, they need structure, they need organization. And these are things that librarians have been doing for centuries for things like books or journals or images or other types of information content. And ideally, we can see as librarians that data are another type of information. They're a complex type for sure. They tend not to have the same kind of structure as a book or a journal does, which requires more work on our part to do. But we already have a long history of making information accessible to other people, to researchers and the public, in ways that they can find, access, interoperate, connect together, and reuse. These are known as the FAIR principles. And the FAIR principles, you probably have heard this before, but they serve as a guiding set of principles for both sharing data and metadata to help guide us in the work that we do, to help define our objectives and our goals. I would add to the FAIR principles two other things. I think the work that I do, I really want researchers and others to be able to understand the data that come to them. So it's not enough, again, to put the data out there and to make it discoverable. How do I help you, as somebody who has not seen the work that I do, understand that work? And more than just understanding it, how do I help you trust the data that I've done? How can I demonstrate that I have followed certain protocols and principles that are in line with good methodology, and I've generated a high quality enough data set that you can trust it to use it to your own research, to reuse that final step of the FAIR principles, that in fact, you can actually do that successfully. So now I want to start talking about my experience starting with Purdue University. I started at Purdue in 2007, and I was there until 2014. And this is a very early time. So in the United States, one of the big events that led to our really getting involved in research data management and sharing was the National Science Foundation, a major funding agency requiring data management plans in 2011. So in 2007, this hadn't been done yet. And in fact, before I got to Purdue, the library dean in 2004, when he joined Purdue, he did a listening tour. He went out and he talked to faculty in a number of different departments to get a sense of the kinds of things that they were doing, but also how they interacted with the library. What were they using the library for? And what kinds of questions or needs did they have with regards to information? And what he heard was a lot of questions and a lot of concern around research data. So he heard that faculty had heard that data sharing requirements were probably coming, but they didn't really know what that meant for them. How would they need to adjust to that? They had a lack of time to organize their data sets. They were doing so many other things that organizing and working with that data was something that they didn't have time for or weren't making time for, but they wanted to. They saw the benefits of trying to organize their data to be more effective for themselves, as well as for others potentially. They needed help describing their data for discovery. They didn't know how to connect their data to other people, to other resources, and to share it effectively with their peers. They wanted to find new ways to manage data. Many researchers will admit to me when I talk with them that, yeah, they manage their data, but they don't do it very well. And even for their purposes, they'd like to find better ways to make their lives easier and more efficient. And then finally, they needed help in archiving their data sets and their data collections. So they often had graduate students who developed a particular data set, but then the graduate student would graduate and go to a different school and leave behind the data set without a clear sense as to how could this be worked with, how could this be archived, how could this be preserved as a useful source of information for their own lab going forward. So lots of questions around research data. And our library's dean said, well, you know, librarians, again, have been doing this for a number of years, for centuries even, with books and journals. Can we apply library science to research data? Can we use the skills that we know as librarians to address these questions that he was hearing from researchers? So how can we take reference, our ability to ask really good questions and to get at the heart of the information needs of researchers? How can we apply that to research data and really understand what it is that they were trying to accomplish and help them do that? How can we take the information literacy skills that we have in teaching students how to find, connect, evaluate, ethically use research data? How to identify those information needs? Could we apply that information literacy skills that we have to research data? And then how can we help them build collections of research data? Again, not just putting a data set out there, but contextualizing it, organizing it, making it discoverable for others. We do that for other information resources. How could we do this for data? And so at Purdue, librarians are faculty. They are expected to do research and to publish and present. And so this could be, at the time, this could be our area of research, or a way that we could really get library science connected to researchers in ways that we hadn't been before. So really having impacts with our research beyond just the library field, but with the larger set of disciplines that are out there. And so in 2006, again, a little bit before I got there, he founded a research center based out of the library called the Distributed Data Curation Center. So our job was to look at how could we not only provide services to researchers, but how can we partner with them directly on their grants as a member of their team to help address these questions as they were happening in that particular project. So I was brought on in 2007 to do that, to look at how we might apply library science to research data as a research partner. Our first grant, this is solely just from the libraries, was the Data Curation Profiles Project. We had a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And their goals for that project was to develop a better understanding of the practices, attitudes, and needs of researchers with regards to managing and sharing their data. We wanted to identify possible roles for librarians in supporting that particular goal of making that happen. And we wanted to develop a tool for librarians to be able to engage with researchers. So as you might imagine, just getting into this field, it's difficult to know where to start. What questions do we ask? What things are we trying to find out? So the Data Curation Profiles Toolkit was designed to enable these kinds of discussions and conversations with researchers and librarians. And I was the project manager for this project. So the Data Curation Profiles Toolkit that we developed was an interview protocol. So it was meant to sit down a researcher and to ask them questions and to get a response, to conduct an interview. And that interview, there were three things we were trying to accomplish. We wanted to know information about a particular data set. So what data were they developing and how did it go through the data lifecycle? What was the unique data lifecycle of that particular data set? The second thing that we wanted to know was what was a researcher doing to manage that data set? What steps were they taking to develop it, to work with it, perhaps to share it amongst their lab or their team? What were they doing to manage it directly? And then what were their thoughts about sort of sharing it at the end? What did they want to do with that data set once the project had concluded? And then finally, we were looking with what would the researcher like to do with that data set, but they weren't for whatever reason. So they had a gap between what they were doing and what they wanted to do. And our goal there was, could we as librarians help address that gap? Could we start to close that to help them do what they wanted to do, but weren't for whatever reason? So one of the key parts of the Data Creation Profiles Toolkit is to develop and understand the data lifecycle for that particular data set that we were talking about. And I showed you a model of a data lifecycle earlier, but that's just a model. It doesn't necessarily apply to the work that happens on the ground. Every data lifecycle is a little bit different. There's different steps, there's different things that are done to the data over time. So we tried to capture the unique aspects of the data set in the Data Curation Profile Toolkit. And you'll see one of the rows there is in gray. That is the part of the data that could be shared with somebody else, that the researcher identified as having value, and maybe they wanted to or they needed to share that with somebody else. So that would be our area of focus in working with that researcher. We also wanted to learn a number of other things about the researcher and their data set. We wanted to know the overview of the research, right? We needed the larger context as to why that data were being generated and what they were doing with the data. So what was the research they were trying to accomplish? We then wanted to know a little bit more about the different types of data that were being generated through that project. So sometimes there's only one type of data being generated, but sometimes there's 3 or 4. How did they connect? What was their purpose? And how they work together to let the researcher accomplish their research question or their research project? We wanted to know what target data for sharing they identified. Again, that gray row in the table that you saw. And then what reuse value did they see for that data set? How might somebody else take that data and use it for a different purpose? We also asked about intellectual property, so things like copyright and ownership. What were they willing to allow others to do with that data? What rights did they want to retain potentially? We looked at how the data were organized and described by themselves. What kind of documentation were they generating, if any? And how is that documentation associated with that data set? We looked at ingest and access. So if they were to share the data, how would they want other people to access it? How would they get it into a repository? How would they share it, in other words? We looked at discovery. So what kinds of things would be needed in terms of metadata or other ways to help people find the data? We looked at, were there any associated tools with the data that needed to accompany or to be referred to in the repository? Was there a software program or a software package that needed to be identified so others could understand and connect with that data set? We looked at interoperability. Were there other data sets that were out there that people can merge this data set with the other data set to create something new? Or were there articles or other outcomes of the data that needed to be identified and connected with the data? We looked at measuring impact. So what kind of return on their investment did they want? Did they want the data set to be cited? Did they want co-authorship? What kinds of impact would they expect from sharing that data? We looked at their data management practices currently, and we looked at preservation steps. If they took any preservation steps themselves, or if they wanted preservation to be done to their data, what might that look like and how might that function? So a very detailed interview. These took more than 2.5 hours to actually do. They were very intense and very in-depth, but they were really valuable. They helped us not just discuss data with researchers, but it gave insight into the areas of attention that we might devote ourselves to as librarians. It helped us to assess information needs both of the individual researcher, and as we did more of these, more broadly, to be able to connect different needs and to see a larger picture as to where we were hearing similar things over and over again. So it gave us insight into what data management and sharing might look like in different disciplines as well. And then it helped us to identify where might we invest our time and our energy as librarians into developing services and support for researchers in managing and sharing their data. So we use the data curation profile, the results, in 2 different ways. So first, again, we were part of the Research Center, the Distributed Data Curation Network, and we would use this as a means to sort of figure out how we could work with a researcher directly. But we also used it as a means to bring in other librarians. So for example, I have no background in chemistry whatsoever. I don't know chemistry at all. But we had a liaison librarian who really focused on chemistry and had a very strong background. So in cases where I wanted to work with or explore data with a chemistry professor, I would try to involve him as much as possible because he had knowledge that I did not. So it's a way to bring other librarians in who weren't focused on data, but still had relevant skill sets and knowledge that would really help me connect with and provide support for the researcher. So a couple of different projects that I did at Purdue that were informed by things like the data curation profiles. This is something called Camp Calcium. This was a research project in which nutrition science researchers were studying the nutritional aspects of a particular diet and its effect on the levels of calcium in the body. So they hosted a summer camp for kids and they monitored their diet very closely. But they were collecting a lot of different variables and had a lot of different people working on this project. And so their data set was very spread out and very unorganized. So what we helped them to do was to identify all the different types of data that they were generating and to connect them into a shared workflow. And then to use that shared workflow as a means to identify what data could or should be shared by bringing it together into a single spreadsheet or a single data point. And that was really helpful for them. I also worked on a grant-funded project with regards to drought. And drought, it sounds pretty straightforward, right? It's a lack of water or a lack of moisture. But drought not only impacts climate and the environment, it impacts things like engineers who need to build structures in particular areas. It impacts the quality of life and poverty, right? So many poverty-stricken areas also suffer from droughts. And so as a result, this group wanted to collect drought-based information on a variety of different subjects and bring it together in a single portal to provide access to researchers who might use that information to do research. And my role in this project was to figure out the metadata schema. So all these different data sets were coming from different directions. How could we create a common metadata schema to enable things like discovery and understandability to enable researchers to use this data effectively to answer their own research questions? So one of the other things that we found from doing these interviews was the question of education kept coming up very frequently. So we would ask researchers, do you want your graduate students to know more about this? Or would it be helpful for your graduate students to have some kind of education or training? And the answer we got always was, oh, yes, that would be fantastic. Please, can we set that up? So the next logical question is, okay, well, what should that training consist of? And their response was, well, we don't really know just how to do it better. So this was the start for another grant that we got from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, where we set out to develop what we called data information literacy. So what were the common themes that researchers expressed of wanting their graduate students to know, and how could we build programs that would teach those concepts to graduate students? So we did a second set of interviews, both with faculty and with graduate students, on 12 different areas that we identified from analyzing the results of the data curation profile interviews. And this is sort of a graphic of the results. And you can see that there's some wide variation in terms of the priorities between faculty and graduate students. Faculty tended to want more sort of the practical on the ground elements of, well, how do I visualize this, right? How do I put that in a paper and convey the work that we're doing? And the graduate students wanted much more sort of the management and the organization type aspects of how do I actually do what you're asking me to do of managing this data. So we had to develop programs that met sort of both of those aspects to be successful from different people's vantage points. So what we did, we had 5 teams from 4 universities, 2 of which were at Purdue. We worked with librarians at Cornell, Minnesota, and Oregon, and we each developed a data information literacy program based on the results of the researcher and the graduate students that we interviewed at our respective institutions. And we each took a different approach. So my team, we worked as embedded librarians. We were there with the project and working with students directly. We had our other team at Purdue offered a series of workshops. We had a mini course from Cornell. They actually taught kind of a 4-credit course for students there. We had a number of educational modules, some in-person classes, but also a lot of online modules. And then we had a one-shot workshop. That's all that they could do at the University of Oregon. But we thought that was important because oftentimes librarians only get one chance to teach information. And so we wanted that experience of what would we do if we only had a 2-hour block to work with. So although we each took different approaches and we each worked with different disciplines and different types of research, we worked together and worked together closely to share information as to how we were developing these courses. And we came up with a shared model for making all of this work. So this is our model, planning, then developing the program, implementing the program, and the assessment and evaluation, and the different steps that we took alongside of that. This is on the web under data information literacy, so you can find it there if you're interested in more detail. Okay, so that was Purdue, and that was a lot. I then moved on to the University of Michigan. So whereas Purdue was primarily project-based, right? We were researchers ourselves, and so our work with researchers had a beginning, a middle, and an end because they were projects. The University of Michigan was interested in developing programs, so ongoing, regularly offered services that didn't necessarily have an endpoint, but were much broader and much more accessible to a number of different researchers than just what a project would be. So, but we started out with the same kind of concept, right? It wasn't that we just wanted myself or people in my department to do this work. We wanted to engage and involve as many librarians as possible because there's a lot of relevant skill sets that are out there. So in addition to having library liaisons, chemistry, sociology, electrical engineers, we have what we call functional specialists. These are people who produce metadata for library content. These are people who work on preserving library content. These are all concepts that are relevant and important to the work that we do with research data. We wanted to have their expertise fold into our program and our project wherever possible. So although we were a team unto ourselves, we tried to bring in as many librarians as possible over the course of the work that we did. So from 2014 to 2016, we spent 2 years really thinking about what would our program look like? How would we prepare to offer research data services on a regular basis? And we went through a couple of different steps to do that. Again, we did a bunch of data interviews. We did not use the data curation profile toolkit because it was too much. It was 2.5-hour commitment to do those. We didn't have much time. We wanted to go broad. So we interviewed, I think, 36 or so different faculty to get a sense as to their needs. We used a much shorter process to do that. But we were focused on identifying themes. So we were listening for researchers to say, I need this, or I would like to have this. And then we coded them as researcher X has a need of Y to enable them to do Z. And we looked at how often similar needs came up and similar outcomes, and we grouped them together to figure out where we might invest our time and our energy in building our program. We held a series of data education sessions and workshops, not for researchers, but for librarians, so that we had an educated library workforce to be able to understand and tackle these issues from their particular vantage points. So for library liaisons, this would help them talk about research data with the researchers they would interact with on a regular basis, because they already have deep relationships with people that we did not. This is a way to prepare them for handling those questions and for allowing us to respond effectively. We held what we called Data Bites discussion forum sessions. So this was a monthly meeting. We would get together and share information. Here's what we're doing this month with research data and developing our programs. But it also gave them a chance to talk about their questions, their concerns, what they were seeing in engaging with researchers. It was a way of sharing that information across a group of people who were interested in this space, and it really was effective in building kind of a community of practice. And then finally, we came up with something called data profile statements. So we wanted to get a sense as to how comfortable librarians were in talking about data. Is this something that they could do themselves if they were asked to? Could they work with reviewing a data management plan, for example? Or did they feel okay with it, but not fully confident? Did they need to collaborate with somebody from the Research Data Services Department? Or were they not confident at all and they wanted to refer whatever the question or situation was to somebody in the Research Data Services Department, with the recognition that we may pull them along with us to help increase their knowledge and their skill set. Again, it's another way to introduce and to pull people together to work with us to raise the entire library capabilities to do this kind of work. So we settled on 6 areas of service at Michigan. There was data management planning, the very beginning, helping people discover and access research data, both in terms of enabling their data to be discoverable and accessed, but also in terms of finding existing data sets that are out there for use for research. We had services with regards to data organization and management. How can we help researchers better organize and manage their data to enable it to be shared later on? We had services around metadata and documentation. How can we help researchers produce high quality metadata or strong documentation to enable the data to be used later on? We focused on data sharing and publication as well as preservation. And a big part of those two were our research data repository. So this was a data repository that we developed at the University of Michigan for use by any researcher associated with the University of Michigan. So if their research generated a data set that did not have a repository that was discipline or subject based that they could use, we were the safety net for them. They could deposit their data set with us because of their affiliation. So that would help them share the data even though they didn't have a resource based on their discipline. We had a number of other services at the University of Michigan as well, not just research data, but they were connected. We had our institutional repository. So our data repository just took data. The institutional repository took things that were meant for humans, right? So papers, presentations, things that were meant to be consumed by human beings. Deep Blue Data was the data repository, things that were meant to be consumed by machines and by software. We offered a set of services through our Clark library, including data visualization and geographic information systems, GIS. And University of Michigan also houses ICPSR, which is not a part of the library, but they're a large social science data repository that's very prominent in their field. So we had close access to their expertise, and we tried to find ways to work together, although not as much as I would have liked to. It was still good to have them on campus. But in 2018, we had a little bit of an organizational change, right? So we brought Deep Blue, our institutional repository, and Deep Blue Data, our data institutional repository, together under one department, under my department. And we did this because we thought that providing institutional repositories together would help make connections between data and papers and presentations that made use of the data more clear. We really wanted that stronger connection. We had an idea that we would sometime in the future bring together the 2 repositories onto one technical platform, which didn't actually happen. It was more complicated than we were able to overcome when I was there, unfortunately. But we also saw publishing as a better model for data sharing than collection building. We saw ourselves, I'll get to this in a moment, but when we do a data curation review, essentially what we're doing is reviewing the data set and kind of acting as an editor for it. So we're looking for places where the data set could be improved or where we could fix errors to make it a higher quality, more impactful data set when we publish it, when we share it at the end of the process. So the way that we sort of explained this was a way to better support open access and data together through our repositories. So for example, we have a publication from one of our graduate students who talks about looking at plagiarism and how do you detect plagiarism through software. And he published in a conference proceeding, but the challenge was, I don't know if you can see this, but it costs $30 to buy the paper. But because he put it in our institutional repository, it's free to anybody who has access to the internet. So that's great, right? But more than that, we have his underlying data set. So the data set that was used to generate the findings in that article are housed in Deep Blue Data. And we connected the data set to the article through the use of a digital object identifier or a DOI. So we were able to present the entire package, if you will, through the repositories that we had, and bringing them closer together just made sense to us organizationally to really promote that aspect. So data curation, I should explain, I think this came up in conversations I've had with other universities in Japan. When we get a data set to Deep Blue Data, before we publish it, we review it. So we open it up, we take a look at the data set itself, we take a look at how are the data structured and organized. Are they organized in a way that makes sense, potentially, to somebody who might want to make use of them? We take a look at the context of the data. So what kind of documentation are there? What kind of metadata are there? Are they enough for people to understand, trust, and reuse that data set? And if not, can we make suggestions for the researcher to provide more information or different types of information? And then we look at the connection between the files. So oftentimes a data set is at least two files. It's the data file and the documentation, the README file or whatever the documentation type is. But more often than not, it's not just two files, it's 5 files, it's 10 files, it's 100 files, it's 1,000 files. And we need to understand how those different files connect and relate to each other, right? So does group A of files connect to group B? And is it obvious, right? Can we look at the holistic data set to see, are we missing something? Are there a group of files that we don't have that we might want to ask for? Or do we have a group of files that maybe we don't need because they're supplementary or they're extraneous, right? So we would do this review, and when we come up with our recommendations, we would write to the researcher to say, hey, thank you so much for depositing your data set with us. Could you give us this information, or could you make these changes so your data set is stronger? And then we would publish that data set once we had all the information we could get about it. But it's really difficult to do. That work is very time intensive. It can be very challenging because it requires some knowledge about the field and about how we handle different types of data. And it can be really difficult because we were a team of 5 at our height. There's no way that all 5 of us could know everything about every different type of data. So we would do the best we can with the information that we had, but we recognized there were places where we were falling short. And so what we wanted to do was to build a larger network of expertise. And this came about from a conversation that some of my friends, some of my peers at different institutions had at a conference of, well, why can't I send you a data set because you know more about this particular format than I do? And why can't you send me that data set because I have expertise in this particular field? And so we figured out a way, like, could we pilot what it might look like to exchange data sets? So if I get a data set that my colleagues at University of Minnesota have greater expertise than I do, could I send them that data set to do the curation review on my behalf? And similarly, could they send a data set where I have more expertise to Michigan to curate on their behalf? And so we developed a data curation network to enable that kind of interaction to be possible. We started out with 6 institutions. I think we're now up to 21 or so of people who are in this network who can exchange data sets and take advantage of the expertise of the other members in the network. So this is the curated steps. This is our shared model for doing the curation review that I just discussed. The first step is to check the files, be sure they open appropriately, be sure that we have all the information that we need before we start doing the review. The next step is the understand the data. This is where we look at the content, the data itself, the context, the metadata and documentation, and the connections that I described. We then would request missing information from the researcher or request some augmented metadata from the researcher, again, working with them to get as much information as we can about the data before we publish it. If we needed to, we would transform file formats for reuse. We would try to move things out of proprietary formats into more open ones. That didn't always happen because that was very difficult to do, but we would try to include that as part of the step. We would then evaluate the data set, particularly for fairness. Is it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable to the fullest extent that we can? And then finally, we would document the work that we did so that we would have a provenance trail of the work that we did on the data set in our repositories. So our data curation workflow, we had folks deposit their data, enter their metadata, upload the data files, agree to the terms of use, and then submit it. Right where they got to the upload data files part, we would do the curated steps, again, before we published it. And once we were done with that, then it would get published and it would be available to anybody out on the internet through our repository. So with the data curation workflow in the data curation network, it's the same process, but there's an extra couple of steps to it, right? So the figure on the right there describes sort of what we do locally. Instead of reviewing the data set ourselves, though, if we wanted to submit it to the network, we would contact the network. It would go through a coordinator. They would select from the curative pool as to who had the expertise or who had the capacity to do it. They would do the curation review. They would send it back to us to contact the researcher and to complete the process. So again, it was a way to gather more information and access more expertise than what we had at any one individual institution. But we do more than just the data curation work through the data curation network. We become an area that I've really relied on to help us think about how do we grow and train new curators, how do we help new librarians get involved in this space. One thing we put together is called the Data Curation Primers. These are short documents that focus on a particular aspect of curation. It could be a data type, it could be a subject, and it really helps curators who maybe aren't familiar with that type of data or that subject go through and to do their own curation review, to ask the good questions to get the information we need to improve the impact, the potential impact of that data set. So here, for example, we've got some primers on the Jupyter Notebooks, which is a means of sort of generating script-supported data, of mass spectrometry, a type of data that's used in chemistry and other places, a MATLAB, so a software that's very popular for engineers, for example. And all of these, if you're not familiar with MATLAB software, for example, you can go open that primer up, take a look at the basic information you need to know about MATLAB in order to work with and curate a data set that was generated from the MATLAB software. We also were involved in a number of different research projects. These are two. One is that the value of data curation surveys. We did two types of surveys in 2021. First, we asked curators from around the US and even from some other countries what they saw as the value of their work. Where were they thinking that they were making an impact? What did they see as the most important priorities for them in terms of doing the curation reviews that they do? And we also sent out a survey to the people who had used our services, the researchers who had deposited data to our repositories, to get a sense as to what value did they see in us providing these services. And that was a particularly gratifying project because we learned, well, first of all, we had a very strong response to that survey. We had like a 48% response rate, which I've never had any kind of response rate for the survey like that for anything else that I've done. And overwhelmingly, people were like, yes, we know that this takes time. We know that this slows down the process a little bit of publishing my data, but having another person with your expertise look at my data is not only appreciated, it's valued. So it was very reaffirming to the work that we were doing and the time that we were spending in this particular area. One last thing before I go on to Buffalo. In 2023, the National Institute of Health, 2022, the National Institute of Health put forth their own data sharing requirement. So any application for funding from the National Institutes of Health as of 2023 now has to include a 2-page data management and sharing statement. And because the NIH was the University of Michigan's major funding sponsor, the #1 source of funds, that got attention very, very quickly. And so I have been trying to talk with different administrators from different departments for years about the importance of this work and what's coming on the horizon. This got their attention. This got us in the door. So what this represents is the University of Michigan Research Data Stewardship Initiative. This was started by our Office of Research, and it included members from the libraries, from IT, from the medical school, from our sponsored programs office. These are folks who help write and support grants once they're made available. Our general counsel's office, our lawyers, and many other folks with a stake in research data management got us all together into a room and focused on 4 different things: on how do we coordinate, how do we work together more effectively to support what we expect will be needed from to satisfy the NIH and other funding agency requirements. How do we raise awareness of what the NIH is asking for and requiring? How do we provide guidance for researchers and helping them navigate through this process? And what kind of policies do we need at the university level to make all of this work? So we had a data policy at Michigan, but it was mostly focused on administrative data. And research was sort of scribbled in there here and there, but it didn't really address research data directly. This was the group to get together and think about what is it we really want as a university to ensure that we're doing what we need to do and that researchers are getting the support that they need to be successful. So that was a very important group. Okay, so moving right along, because I know I'm running out of time, my apologies. I'm now at the University at Buffalo. I'm the Associate University Librarian for Research Collections and Outreach. We are just getting started. I've been there now for a little bit more than a year, so we're not the University of Michigan. We don't have the same kind of resources, and we're not as far along as Michigan was, but we are still diving right in and working on making things happen. So you may not be as familiar with the University at Buffalo as you are with, say, Michigan. I want to talk a little bit about the university. We are what we call New York's flagship university. So we are part of the SUNY system. This is the State University of New York, as Emmy mentioned in her introduction. This is a group of 68 different schools. But of these 68, the University at Buffalo, as well as one or two others, are really where the research is focused. We are where the state of New York invests a fair amount in research and in our research productivity. We have about 30,000 students, about a third of whom are graduate students, so a very large graduate student population. And we do about $474 million worth of research each year. It's about a quarter of what Michigan does, but it's still fairly substantive. And we have a number of different areas of success, primarily in our science and technology, as well as our medical departments with grants. So getting started, before I came to Buffalo, again, just like at the University of Michigan, the NIH announcement really got their attention. And so they put together 4 committees at very high administrative levels to start thinking about what do we need to do at the University at Buffalo to get ahead of this, to ensure that we're able to meet our requirements once those come due. And so the 4 different committees were on data repository and services. This was chaired by my boss, Aviva Lajoie, who's the university librarian. We focused on graduate student needs and services. This was chaired by Graham Hamill, who's the dean of the graduate school. We were focused on the needs of the medical school, particularly around safety and security. This was chaired by a senior associate dean for clinical and translational medicine. And we focused on our technology needs, which was chaired by the chief information officer. So you see, again, very high people in very important positions were engaged and involved in thinking about the next steps at the University at Buffalo. So again, we're still sort of working on developing our own support structures and services, but I wanted to focus on this because this represents the kind of approach that we're taking, right? We don't want it just to be the library. We recognize that the library cannot do this alone, that it needs to have strong relationships and connections across the university to make all of this work. And so this graphic is meant to represent the perspective of our pre-award services. These are people who help researchers get grants at the University at Buffalo. And they really see the library as a very important partner in this, in helping shape the data management and sharing plan so that it is accurate and that it can be supported at the university, as well as connecting with the Office of Research for the larger grants because they offer services such as grant writing and grant review. So all 3 of us really are working together, figuring out ways we can work together to improve the grants process, to understand what it is that we're being required to do as a result of getting the grant, and then to follow through on those responsibilities. So data librarians at the University at Buffalo. Right now we have 1 data librarian. She focuses on the health sciences. Hopefully by the time I get back to the United States, we will have a job ad out for a head of research data services. And that person will either have a focus on science and engineering or on the social sciences and humanities. Whoever we hire as our head of research data services, we will have 1 more position after that. So we will hire for whoever we didn't get from the head search. So if we got somebody with science and engineering, we'll hire somebody for social science and humanities. So we'll have a team of 3 at the end of this. All of our data librarians will have the following responsibilities. I want them to do training, consulting, and outreach. So working with researchers one-on-one to provide education, to provide answers to their questions and help guide them through the process, and to help connect them with the larger environment of research data sharing expectations and services. I want them to have partnerships with faculty and graduate students. So not just sort of a one-off relationship, but are there places where we can build and develop really strong, meaningful connections with the researchers to really understand their data and work on their needs at an in-depth level. I want them to build relationships with university administrators. Again, the library cannot do this by ourselves. We need the expertise and the authority and guidance from other parts of the university to be successful at this scale that we expect. Again, the NIH is our major funding agency at University at Buffalo as well. We expect we'll get a lot more demand as the requirement for sharing data comes due, right? As the grants that they got in 2023 come to an end, we're going to get more data sets coming our way. How do we ensure that we're ready for that? I want them to be involved in policy development at the university level to really figure out what do we need to do at the university. And then I want them to help with strategic planning. How do we not just prepare for where we are now, but where is it we want to go? And how do we get there? Where do we make investments? They'll take all three of us and myself and more to figure that out. So one of the things that we've done at the University at Buffalo so far, one of the outcomes of the medical committee in particular was a desire to have graduate students do more data-intensive research. There is a data set in the US that is sponsored by the NIH called All of Us. This is a very strong data set. It has more than 1 million different entries, and it contains demographic information, genomic information, health information for 1 million different people. So a lot of data and a lot of really valuable data that could be used for research. The All of Us repository also has a set of tools that allow you to analyze the data and to try things out and to explore what research might be possible or of interest for your particular field. And so they had a program for training and engaging academic libraries to enable us to better understand and work with this data, and then to share that information with researchers at the University of Buffalo or other programs. So I suggested to our health sciences librarian that we apply for this. We did, she got it, and she's been doing some instructional outreach and some educational programming in support of this database to make connections and relationships. So even though this doesn't focus on management and sharing directly, it helps us establish a foundation to work with researchers and to bring those concepts up as we engage and discuss this with them. So it's a way of sort of having a side door to introduce management and sharing to people who might otherwise not think of that immediately. We also have another sort of area of need was a space for graduate students to come and to learn the software to do data-intensive research. And so we will be developing a data lab using space in the library to do this. And again, even though this isn't directly focused on management and sharing, it's our space, or it's a space in our building, and it's space that our librarian will use to offer her instructional research workshops and such. But it also gives her an opportunity, again, to introduce data management and sharing to graduate students who may not be thinking about that immediately. So it's a side door to those concepts. We do have an institutional repository at University at Buffalo, the UBIR. We do not have a separate data repository, and so we have received some data sets to our institutional repository, but we only have one repository manager, and it's all been too much for her. She does not have the knowledge or the capacity to do the data curation reviews that we think are really important to ensure that the data we're putting out there are impactful. And so we have since moved to subscribe to become members of the Data Dryad repository. So Dryad is a third-party repository. It's outside of our institution. They are a nonprofit. They serve as our repository of record for the University at Buffalo. So because of our membership, University at Buffalo researchers can deposit their data with Dryad, and curation services are a part of the services that they offer. And they have expertise to do a really thorough job with the curation review. So it's important for us to recognize the limits of our resources and to figure out solutions that don't necessarily involve us having to do everything, but to work with other partners and providers who can provide the services that we know that we need. So we have Data Dryad right now. I am really excited though to tell you that in the fall, the SUNY organization with support from the state of New York put together a program for digital transformation projects to support advancing the capabilities of SUNY institutions in ways that would advance our research capabilities or our digital progress. And so my boss and I, Aviva, put together a proposal to develop a data repository for the entire SUNY system. along with associated services. And again, there are 68 different SUNY institutions. Most of them are not generating a lot of research, but they are generating some research. And even smaller schools need a resource to be able to manage and share their data. So what we hope to do is build a repository that will be able to handle data potentially coming from all different SUNY institutions. And we got word a month and a half ago that our proposal was accepted. So we start work in December. We're still very much in the planning phase of figuring out what precisely we're going to do and how to build this. But I'm very excited to work on this project. I think it'll be very impactful. And what I'm particularly excited about is that our team consists of people from all over SUNYs with different expertise. So it's going to be led by my boss, Aviva, as well as a high-level administrator in the SUNY system. I will be on the working group, but working with folks from IT, working with provosts, associate provosts, working with vice presidents, working with senior directors. So a lot of high-powered people who can get things done with a variety of different skill sets and perspectives. So looking forward to that very much. So I know I'm probably over time. I want to stop by saying final thoughts. Again, this is very much an evolving space. We have a lot of challenges to handle, but there's also a lot of opportunities, in particular opportunities to come together and to work together and to figure this out collectively rather than as individual institutions in silos. And so I hope, and it sounds like from the conversations I've had thus far for universities in Japan, you have a similar kind of approach of how do you work together collectively to make this all happen and to benefit everybody. And I think that's the right approach that I'm really excited about. So thank you very much.